Okay, almost good afternoon to everyone. After this, heavy morning session, which focused on the global affairs and, the relationship of global affairs from İBN HALDUN'in perspective, we will focus on the law and economics and its relationship with İBN HALDUN''s ecosystem of thought. I would like to invite the speakers of the session. Firstly, I would take really the pleasure of and the honor of inviting Mr. Rodney Wilson, Professor. His presence is of special importance to me because I am also interested in Islamic finance and we are raised with his work, please. Secondly, I would like to invite Professor Habib Ahmed from Durham University and Sabri Orman, Professor Ar Hoca from Central Bank of the Turkish Republic. And finally, we should give voice to the young generations as well, I would like to invite our Hafiz from IUM, a Hafiz, an economist, as well as a corporate governance guy, Mohammad Zakaria from International Islamic University of Malaysia. Please. So, since we are really getting out of time, I will give this voice, the turn, without speaking too much, to Mr. Rodney Wilson first. He will talk about the risk management and risk sharing in Islamic finance and its relationship with its İBN Haldun perspective. I would again kindly remind that since we have limited time, it will be great if the speakers can keep their speeches around 20 minutes so that we have at least some time for the question and answer session. Thank you.
Better, yeah. Thank you very much for the introduction. It's a great pleasure to be here at İBN HALDUN University. My first time here, but of course I've been in Istanbul. It's a wonderful city many times, so it's very nice to be back again, and I feel honored to be invited. My talk is on risk management and risk sharing in Islamic finance. I'd just like, it's on PowerPoint slides, before I sort of commence the slides, I'd just like to make a couple of remarks about the relationship with my talk, with the sort of the theme of the symposium, and also just say, you'll hear more about İBN HALDUN from my colleague, Habib Ahmed, who's going to speak next, but I'll just make a couple of remarks about that as well. Firstly, one of the themes is, of course, power, economic development, and morality. Firstly, power. If we look at Islamic finance, what we can say is we've got the power of ideas, the power of basically sort of creative power, basically in terms of innovation and finance. It's not powerful in the sense of dominant institutions. We don't have that. Most Islamic finance institutions are quite small, but the ideas are important, particularly in the context of what's happened in the global financial crisis and the lack of morality in conventional banking. Economic development. Obviously, we've got the Islamic Development Bank, which has been going since 1975, long time. But of course, most Islamic finance is in the hands of basically banks which are primarily retail banks actually, it's commercial banks, but commercial Islamic banks. They're not specifically concerned with development finance, they're mainly concerned indeed with retail finance, consumer finance, more really demand side finance and supply side finance. But nevertheless, it is making a contribution to economic development in the countries where it's become rather important, particularly in Saudi Arabia, some of the other Gulf countries, and of course in Malaysia as well, where Islamic finance is very much on the agenda, and of course in Pakistan. The other point about morality, obviously all transactions as far as Islamic banks are concerned and all the contracts have to be Sharia compliant. They've got systems of governance that ensure that works. I've written about this kind of thing myself in the book which I wrote about legal, regulatory and governance issues in Islamic finance. It was published a few years ago, which you can read. But clearly the Sharia audit of Islamic financial institutions does ensure that there's another filter which ensures basically that they are operating in a moral context. İBN Haldun, obviously in terms of this talk, one of the things he was concerned with was obviously the rise and declines of great civilizations, and indeed in economic terms you can say the economics of the business cycle, because you get this idea of long-term cycles, maybe 70 years or more. We've just come out of the global financial crisis, which can be seen as a kind of turning point. And again, that sort of fits in with the idea of what happens following on crises and the readjustment of relations and so on. Clearly, there's a lot of criticism of conventional banking, of its behavior, of the way it's basically, as we heard in the previous session, absorbed large amounts of money from governments without very much to show for it, and resulted in other budgets being cut back, like education, health, and so on. That's true in the United States. It's actually true in Ireland, where I'm from originally. Similar things happened. So there's been a great fallout and detrimental effects from basically conventional banks that have failed or threatened to fail and have been rescued by government at tremendous cost. Islamic banking provides an alternative model. Not saying it's going to take over, but nevertheless it does provide an alternative view of how finance should be conducted. And it's worth saying that none of the Islamic banks got into serious trouble or imposed burdens on government during the global financial crisis. There was some problems in Dubai, but they were handled quite rapidly, and then the banks emerged basically unscathed. Okay, I'm going to turn now to the slides, given our time. So I'm going to firstly, that's the title slide. We've got a content slide that will basically tell us where we're going. So we're going to be looking at basically the various stakeholders first and how they share risk in Islamic financial institutions. We'll look at risk transfers in Islamic finance. Obviously, risk getting transferred from one party, was one group of stakeholders to another. We'll look at the issue of managing credit risk. So we're going to look at the different types of risk: liquidity risk, operational risk, macroeconomic risk, reputational or Sharia risk, which is very specific to Islamic banks, ownership risk, which is also specific to Islamic banks and financial institutions, and then issues of risk mitigation. So that's where we're kind of heading, and I'll go for the fairly brisk pace so that we can have time for discussion after. So turning first to the stakeholders sharing risks, basically by the, we've got the shareholders and then we've got depositors. I'm going to say more about in the next slide how they share the risk basically, and what the effects are in terms of that. Obviously the clients themselves are at some risk. In any bank, never mind an Islamic bank, if the bank goes basically under or is gets into real difficulties, then the clients may find that their period of finance is reduced, that they have to repay. and that more or less immediately, and that poses problems. So we can say that they do have risk. Government also has risk, because basically if banks fail, then as we've just said earlier, the governments have to bail them out. So we have gainers and losers from risk management. Essentially, Islamic banking lowers risk for shareholders and depositors, and results in, one issue is, of course, that if you get careful risk management is very desirable, but risk management involves basically reducing risk, which is, of course, desirable, but it can also result in financial exclusion, because the way of reducing risk may be to limit who you advance funds to. And of course, the other side of basically risk management is it may cause things not to be supported, projects, activities not to be supported that really are worthy of support, and results in more vetting of those seeking finance. So in a sense, there's a kind of trade-off between risk management and risk transfer. We have to be sort of aware of that risk management sounds a good idea, and it is a good idea, but obviously you can go too far and then only sort of keep financing the same people over and over again and not finance new untried ventures and so on. So that's one of the issues. Okay, turning now to the next slide and looking at risk transfers in Islamic finance. What we can say is that there is a risk transfer to depositors. Those of current accounts or checking accounts or transaction accounts, it's all the same, basically have their deposits guaranteed in an Islamic bank as of a conventional bank. However, to get a return in an Islamic bank, you can't have a savings account. You've got an investment account, which is sometimes structured using a mudaraba type contract. And basically what that means is it's a kind of profit sharing account. So you share in the bank's profit. But of course, the value of the deposits also, the amount of the deposit cannot be guaranteed. So the current accounts or checking accounts or transaction accounts are guaranteed by government. But basically the other accounts, the equivalent of savings accounts, are not guaranteed. So in a sense, that means there's more risk to the depositors, basically, with an Islamic bank. So one issue is, well, does the lack of investment deposit protection facilitate risk absorption? And to some extent it does, but there's a sort of a gap between the theory and the practice, because in practice, there's very little risk as far as depositors are concerned, even those with investment mudaraba deposits. And I asked the question, is risk management more challenging for Islamic financial institutions? Obviously, conventional banks focus on credit risk on loans. With Islamic banks, you also have some credit risks, but of course they don't loan. They don't have loans as such. Instead, they use Murabaha, for example, and Ijara. I won't go into all the detail of these terminologies, but we can talk about these later. But basically with Murabaha and Ijara, you have ownership risk, because with Murabaha, the bank purchases a commodity or a good on behalf of the client, resells it to the client for a markup, so it has ownership, even if briefly, and that brings risk. Similarly, of Ijara, which is a leasing contract, the bank financier has ownership, and that again brings risk. And then again, we have Musharaka contracts, which didn't used to be very popular, but are becoming more popular because many of them are so-called diminishing Musharaka. Again, what we have there is basically a type of profit-sharing risk, because you don't know what the profit's going to be in advance. It goes up and down. So basically, we have an equity risk of capital losses with these, which should be a feature of all Mudaraba and Musharaka contracts. So just to say that the risk transfers are somewhat different in Islamic finance to what goes on in conventional finance. and in many ways unique. Okay, next thing is credit risk in Islamic banking. We're now moving on to look at the different types of risk and talking about each briefly in turn. We say more about credit risk than the other types because credit risk is the main risk which is faced. Obviously, what we mean by credit risk is late settlement of obligations. That can be due to genuine financial difficulties. Islamic banks can take a kind of moral position which conventional banks don't. So the issue is why people are failing to make their repayments or failing to pay the money which is owed. If we look at Quranic teaching, look at Surah 280, if a debtor is in difficulty, grant him time, but it's easy for him to repay. If you remit by way of charity, that's best for you if only you knew. Now, how does one interpret that in terms of contemporary finance? Well, one way is to say, well, it can result in one action by the bank can be to reschedule, but keep the same financing methods and terms as before with no penalty to the borrower. Obviously, that's not that desirable, but nevertheless, it means that the finance can still be basically classified as performing finance on the books of the financial institution. So rescheduling is a good way of dealing with this, and it means grant time, basically, and of course the surah reading is about granting time. Furthermore, another possibility is to swap existing financial obligations for a Card Hassan loan, which is basically a loan with no interest on it. There's not much point in doing that unless the loan is going to basically ensure that the initial financial obligations can be met. But this is done by Islamic banks in some cases. Obviously, it's not profitable for the bank, but again, it means that the assets are still performing. They're not written off, basically, because you provided this fresh tranche of finance specifically to enable those repayments to continue. Also, of course, you can have remission. Remission, of course, is costly from the bank's perspective because it means essentially you're writing off the assets. But in the case of someone who's basically facing genuine financial difficulties, maybe because of ill health and so on, then basically there's a case for remission, and that will, of course, bring some goodwill from other clients, because they may say, well, the bank's been fairly merciful, if you like, in this context, and therefore we're very happy to bank with this institution because it's not basically adopting very harsh measures. For example, during the financial crisis in the States, many banks basically foreclosed on the mortgages that they were given. People were forced out of their houses. The houses were repossessed and so on. This is very undesirable. In most countries that doesn't happen, happily, but nevertheless does happen in some countries, and it happened in the United States. And that clearly is an issue. Okay, so that's credit risk. A couple more slides that deal with credit risks, different aspects of it. Sorry, I didn't put this up. Yeah, I should have watched the screen rather than read it here. That's what I've just been talking about. Okay, so sure. Repayments risk. I won't talk about this too much. Basically, Islamic banks face moral hazard problems. You get a high degree of trust in Islamic finance, but this can be abused. People abuse anything. Unfortunately, that trust can be abused. Peer pressure makes borrowers acknowledge their responsibilities. This is a kind of micro-financial type model, which also works with Islamic banks. There's also issues about asymmetric information, which is a deterrent to mudaraba musharaka financing. This basically makes concealment of the financial position easier because the bank's sharing in the profits. It's easy to understate the profits, and then there's less money which is handed out to the financial institution. Okay, we come to unscrupulous defaulters. This is basically cannot pay versus will not pay, and you do get, unfortunately, people like that. Obviously, there can be Islamic banks, like conventional banks, have to take action against such people, so defaulters can be blacklisted. And also you can have ways of seeking redress, which are mentioned on this slide. Okay. You can also have financial penalties. You can have a fine for late payments, but the bank itself shouldn't profit from that, because it would be, essentially, you'd be looking at something which was corresponding to riba interest, which would be wrong. So what you could do is you can have a financial penalty, but the proceeds from that financial penalty are given to charity, so that basically there's no gain permissible for the financier. Payment safeguards. This involves sequestration of assets. Murabaha and Ijara involve real financial assets. Obviously, those assets can potentially be taken if there's a default, but the assets may not be worth much to the financier, and their resale value is limited. Quite a lot of Islamic banking, as I said earlier, is retail finance. A lot of it's financing consumer items, including cars and home purchase. So basically, a lot of this is based on salary being directly paid into a bank, making the advance, and that kind of makes it safer. And of course, banks can actually impose limits on personal access to salary until the bank claims are met. So Islamic banks can, because of their methods of financing, can adopt quite a strong position. Okay, I'm going to go fairly quickly through the other types of risk that we're concerned with and just say something about how these relate to Islamic banks. Liquidity risk. Basically, this arises with, obviously, one way of ensuring that this is reduced is basically to have sufficient, for the bank to hold sufficient liquidity. And of course, Islamic banks, like conventional banks, have to abide by Basel III requirements, which are enforced around the world by central banks on basically Islamic banks. So what can they do? Because obviously they can't hold conventional assets that bear interest for liquidity purposes. So they can use Murabaha interbank deposits. I won't explain how those work. They can also use Sukuk. There are special Sukuk that basically have been issued to manage liquidity risk. These have been quite successful. However, in some markets, you have very little activity. In Malaysia, for example, is a very active market in Sukuk, but in the Gulf, the market's rather inactive, which reduces their value for liquidity purposes. You can also reduce the asset and liability mismatch, which is a good way of countering liquidity risk. And Islamic banks try to do that, but inevitably the assets are basically long-term. The assets are long-term, liabilities are short-term, and that basically creates the inevitable tension in banking, including in Islamic banking. Okay, let's move on to operational risk. This basically used to be mainly about reporting systems, but today a lot of it's about information technology risk and data protection. They're concerned about hacking into clients' accounts. Happily, this hasn't happened in any significant Islamic bank, but obviously it's a risk, and it's costly to have the firewalls and so on to prevent this happening. Islamic banks being relatively small in relation to some sort of conventional banks, it's more expensive to provide these factors. You can argue that operational risks within the banks themselves, of employee misdemeanors and so on, less risky in the case of Islamic banks because people are entering Islamic banks not simply to make money, but because of a religious factor, religious motivation. It encourages people to be honest. And also there's an emphasis in Islam on formal contracts, which are obviously an important way of reducing operational risk. Okay, moving on briefly. Macroeconomic risk. Obviously, this arises from government, basically. If you've got large fiscal deficits, and obviously this increases risk in the financial sector and causes problems. Also inflation, of course, which is quite often an outcome, a result of fiscal deficits, reflected in financing costs, and of course profit shares paid to the depositor. You've also got exchange rate risk. These are not unique to Islamic banks, but Islamic banks have to cope with all these different things, basically. Happily, in the countries where Islamic banking is most developed, like the Gulf countries, there's very minimal exchange rate risk because the currencies are basically pegged to the dollar. Malaysia a little bit, but not too much either. The currency's been reasonably stable. Unique to Islamic banks are Sharia risk. This is basically to do with, we won't go into all the details of Sharia governance of Islamic banks, but essentially they've got Sharia boards that supervise their operations. They basically supervise Sharia compliance within the institution. Obviously, Sharia boards change their minds, or they should change their minds if they're given some problem to some contract to look at, and they decide that it's no longer a valid contract. That obviously is desirable, because why have a board if it doesn't, if it's always looking in the same way at particular contracts. So we've got specific examples of, for example, former Sharia compliant contracts which are no longer valid. We had the example of Musharaka Sukuk, where the capital was guaranteed. You can't guarantee capital under Musharaka contracts, so that was basically essentially a mistake. That was admitted, and then again that was kind of rectified. But it did result in people that held those type of sukuks being very disillusioned with Islamic finance. We've had the conflicts over Tawarug, conflicting fatwa, and that has also caused some confusion and has resulted in risk. I won't go into the reputational issues. I think we can answer that in questions if need be. I've got 2 more slides just to indicate where we are, and I'd like to deal with these in a little bit of detail. First is ownership risk. With Islamic banks, you have ownership risk because with Murabaha, for example, the bank is the first purchaser, it's got first purchaser obligations on resale. If there's a default, the bank can retain the ownership of the commodity being financed, but it may have difficulty finding a buyer and there's an exposure to capital loss. With the Ijara, which we mentioned earlier, the contract, which is essentially a leasing contract, the bank has lesser responsibilities, and it has to be an operating lease, it can't be a financing lease. Again, I'm happy to go into the detail of that if anyone asks. Obviously, if it's property or equipment that's defective in some way, and the bank is obliged to remedy the matter, and the bank will be responsible for the insurance of the leased asset. So there's quite a lot of obligations on the bank, which are non-traditional obligations that you don't find in basically conventional banking. With Musharaka, there's a co-ownership, and that is obviously ownership is shared. That means shared responsibilities and potential losses. Okay, coming to the final slide, which is risk mitigation. I'm just saying a little bit about this. Obviously, banks have to pay due diligence in terms of the client that they're advancing funds to. This applies to both conventional banks and Islamic banks. You look at the client's employment status, if it's a retail bank. You look at whether they're employed or self-employed and so on. A length of time in present occupation, job security. It's like a checklist that you go down, basically. And banks, whether Islamic or conventional, do this. Problem, of course, is if someone is basically a new client and you're quite strict in terms of the risk mitigation factors, in terms of due diligence, that can result in financial exclusion. People not being able to go to banks and get financing at all. So they go to money lenders, whatever instead, which is not very desirable. So there's a kind of tension there, basically, between the desire to mitigate risk and the need to be more inclusive. Also, Islamic finance, there's a specification of repayments. Repayments usually, I mean, the big quite a large proportion of Islamic banking finances for mortgages on properties of various sorts. So the money which is in the form of monthly repayments is taken by direct debit from a current account or by standing order, or monthly or quarterly repayments and a lump sum on termination. So the bank is the client has to sign up for that. So the client that will obviously give priority to that, to meeting those obligations. And that reduces risk quite a bit for the client, but not everybody, for the bank rather, but not everybody can give these kind of guarantees. Then there's the issue about valuation of any collateral pledge. Obviously you need an independent valuation and a possible re-valuation if the financing is long-term. So what I've tried to do is give you a flavor. The point to take away basically is Islamic banks are providing the same kind of financial services for the most part as conventional banks. However, they're doing it in a different way. They're doing it in a way which is Sharia compliant. That's what makes them distinctive. So that's the first sort of point. Second point is the point I've stressed at several points about basically financial exclusion. There is a tension between basically effective risk management and attempt to mitigate risk as far as possible and actually trying to increase financing to a wider circle of businesses and people and so on. And that's one of the dilemmas which faces Islamic banks today. Islamic banks are particularly developed obviously in the Gulf and Malaysia and Pakistan as well. But obviously the developments elsewhere have been a little bit disappointing in terms of their penetration of the market basically. But nevertheless, it's here to stay. The global financial crisis highlighted the faults with conventional banking, and those haven't really been overcome. Conventional banks are regarded as amoral, if not immoral, by many, and that's an ongoing issue, basically. And to some extent, they can maybe learn something from Islamic banks, but obviously, there's a long way to go. Okay, thank you very much for your attention, and if any questions, very happy to try to answer them. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Wilson. Without losing too much time, I would like to invite the Professor Ahmed for his presentation. Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum and very good afternoon. Okay, my presentation, as you see, I have a long title. First of all, I really want to thank the organizers for inviting me here, giving this opportunity to present some ideas which I wanted to work for a long time. And because of this conference, I really put down the ideas on a paper. So what I'm going to do is basically cover three key issues. The first is look at İBN Haldun's idea of circle of justice and development, and then from this try to derive some of the propositions, which I'm calling IK propositions, and try to look at these from contemporary perspectives and apply some of these propositions in terms of the practice of Islamic finance. Given the shortage of time, let me just move directly to the So the key issue is when we're talking about development, actually, given the contemporary context, which was kind of discussed partly by Professor Hamour yesterday, there is a development dilemma in terms of the maldistribution of growth among different segments of the population. And as you see, the top, in the last 25 years, the top 1% of the population basically got 23% of the growth benefits, while the bottom 50% of the population got half of that, around 12%. So this is, I think, a critical issue in terms of when I'm looking at development, I'm going to be focusing on this unjust growth which has taken place. Now, of course, there are different ways in which we can try to explain this disparity. For example, one of the ways which it can be explained was, as mentioned by Professor Hamur yesterday, in terms of looking at Thomas Piketty's worldview in terms of the share of capital among the capital providers, share of growth among the capital providers and the workers. Another stream of literature, contemporary literature, trying to define development and growth relates to law and economics. And here, the discussion is about rule of law and legal systems which kind of define and protect property rights and how they can affect economic outcomes. And as we have seen, this has become a trend among international organizations, including United Nations. For example, the Sustainable Development Goal number 16 actually deals with law, justice, and strong institutions. And one of the targets is to promote rule of law and ensure equal access to justice for all. Now, to go back to Ibn Khaldun's perspective, this is a quote directly taken from Ibn Khaldun. Actually, at least I've seen it twice in his Muqaddamah, and it's partly reflected in the earlier presentation by Professor Ali Nizamuddin today. It is called Circle of Justice by Golay and also Theory of Development by Omar Chapra. I'm calling it Circle of Justice and Development. Let me read this because it's very important and in some ways forms the key, in some ways, component of my presentation. So this is an advice given by Ibn al-Masudi to the king. He says, "O king, the might of royal authority materializes only through the religious law, obedience to God and compliance with his commands and prohibitions. The religious law persists only through royal authority. The mighty royal authority is achieved only through men. Men persist only with the help of property. And then the only way to property is through cultivation. And the only way to cultivation is through justice." And then he defines justice as a balance set up among mankind. The Lord has set it up and appointed an overseer of it, and that is the ruler. So this is in some ways the cycle of, or the circle of justice and development. And we can in some ways try to understand the linkages between these different components. So we have the state and the sovereign, its link with the people, and the people's link with wealth and development, and then the link between wealth and development and justice, and then a link between justice and law, and finally the link between the law and the state. And actually Ibn Khaldun, if you read the Muqaddamah, he actually touches on all of these things in pretty much details. So what I'm going to do is quickly go over some of the aspects of these relationships. When it comes to state and people, he says basically he assumes humans have cross purposes and they're inclined to evil. So there is a need for humans for social organization. And if there is no restraining influence like a ruler, this would lead to trouble and destruction and uprooting of mankind. So the ruler achieves the power through the help of the people. Ruler can only succeed if there is strong group feeling among the people. And then the people, their relation to the ruler is defined by the confidence they have in the ruler. And this confidence can increase only if the ruler is beneficent and shows interest in their lives. So that is the first part. The second part, in terms of the relationship between people and wealth, wealth and development sustains people's livelihood. And wealth basically is derived from business and gainful activities. Now, there are different ways in which these gainful activities will happen in the economy. He identifies, among other selves, that property rights should be protected so that the individuals who engage in business and activities, economic activities, they can reap benefits of profits. And he also mentions low level of taxes. For example, he says high taxes discourages productive activities, and actually even lowers the tax revenues. So this is the so-called Laffer curve, sometimes discussed during contemporary times. And he also mentions that states should not engage in economic activities because states are very powerful and they crowd out private sector activities. As for the third relationship, this is very important because he has a section with the title, Injustice Brings About Ruin of Civilization. So he's talking about injustice in economic sphere leads to decline in gainful activities and wealth creation. Then he defines different types of injustices which can destroy ultimately not only the economy but civilizations. He talks about infringement on property rights. He talks about forced labor, for example, unjustified claims, imposition of heavy duties and taxes. But most importantly, he also talks about a very important, in some ways, injustice which can happen through contracts. So he's talking about unjust transactions in which one party benefits at the cost of the other in contracts. That is also a form of injustice and in some ways can lead to decline and ruin of civilizations. As for the justice and law link, number D, he distinguishes between two types of laws. One is the religious law and the other is the rational law. Religious law, of course, is something which is divine and it provides benefits both in this world and the hereafter. One of the features of the religious law, according to İBN HALDUN, is that it considers both the general interest of the people and also the particular interest of the rulers. Now, when it comes to rational law, these are, of course, humanly created law by the states. And he talks about that these laws can be just or unjust. So if it is unjust, that means the ruler or a group of people, it serves only the needs of a group of people. And these laws are usually mainly considered the worldly interest. And finally, the law and state. The state enacts the law. Mainly, laws are means of social control and exercise of power. And he acknowledges that religious law, the authority lies with the mufti, the religious scholars, not with the state. The role of the state is to actually establish the institutions, legal institutions, through which the laws can be implemented. So he talks about the courts which the state should provide to adjudicate disputes, and also the police to enforce the court's verdicts. So this is in some ways a summary of the circle of justice and law. From this discussion, actually what I do is develop some propositions. Given the time, I'll not go over the details of the proposition, but what I'll do is I'll read the propositions and then try to look at some of the contemporary ideas related to the propositions. The first proposition is that justice is key to understanding and explaining development. And as I mentioned, İBN HALDUN actually is very much concerned with injustices which can basically ruin not only economies but civilizations. Now, in terms of contemporary views, not talking about the new liberal framework, but in terms of contemporary discussions on, by Islamic scholars, I think there's some discussion on justice itself, but not too much discussion on linking justice to development, as İBN HALDUN has done. And within justice, there is discussion in terms of distributive justice and what we call commutative justice, which happens in contracts. So distributive justice is basically relates to justice in proportions, and commutative justice relates to the justice of equality in contracts, for example. The second proposition relates to justice is key to understanding and explaining development. And here we'll see, again, looking at the contemporary Islamic kind of discussions, the concept of justice and development, they are actually, there's not too much discussion in contemporary Islamic scholarship in terms of the human nature and justice. I think, let me just read the proposition, humans are prone to injustice, and in the absence of constraining laws, the parties with more power will unjustly usurp the property of weaker party. Again, this comes from İBN HALDUN's writings. And we have similar ideas actually in contemporary literature. For example, the power principle to justice, it defines individuals who serve their own interests and define them to be corrupt. And there's a need for a coercive state power to actually, in some ways, mitigate these tendencies. Otherwise, unfair practices take hold in the economy. The third proposition relates to justice and transactions, where İBN HALDUN says that while there are various ways in which properties can be appropriated unjustly, one way is to do this is through unfair transactions. And here we're basically talking about contracts which are basically used to extract unfair benefits and rents from other people. Now, taking the Islamic perspective here, of course, in transactions, riba and gharar are prohibited mainly because to prevent appropriation of property through unjust means. But in agency contracts, there's another concept of justice, which is the balance between risk and return. And these are expressed through the maxims of al-kharaj bid-daman and al-ghum bi-an-ghum, which basically links benefits to liabilities or risk-taking. So when we talk about justice, it is not only equality in terms of in exchange contracts, but also in terms of the balance between risk and return in agency contracts. The fourth proposition of İBN HALDUN is about the difference between rational laws and religious laws. And according to İBN HALDUN, he says, while some rational laws can be just and equitable, other man-made laws could favor the interest of one group, such as the dominant class. Key purpose of religious law, however, is to instill justice and prevent tyranny. But if you look at the contemporary discussions, in the past there was a discussion in terms of difference between natural law and positive law. The natural law being God's law. Actually, Aquinas, he linked natural law to religion and basically talked about natural law in terms of God's law, which reflects God's wisdom. And positive law is what we have nowadays, laws created by not only humans, but the states, nation states. And some of the positive law can be unjust because there's a basically, for example, you can have a positive law which in some ways rationalizes slavery or, for example, discrimination. In an Islamic perspective, we distinguish between Sharia and fiqh, the Sharia being the text or the nas, which basically is the Quran and Sunnah, and fiqh, which is the derived law where an human effort is made to derive laws. So this is the Islamic positive law, and actually, as we will see in Islamic finance, what is used is the Islamic positive law. And finally, the authority to develop law lies with the state in contemporary nation states. And İBN HALDUN, in some ways, talks about the distinction between the, as I said, religious law and the rational laws. And he says that while the state has the power to enact rational laws, historically the authority of religious laws lies with the Sharia scholars, and the state provides the institutional framework to implement the laws. Now, what has happened, of course, in contemporary Muslim world is most of the Muslim countries have adopted different types of Western legal systems, either the common law or the civil law systems. But with the introduction of Islamic finance, we see that Islamic commercial law is being used in the financial sector. But there's an issue about who has the authority to in some ways, develop this law. If in the absence of national authority, if there's no national central Sharia board like we have in Indonesia or Malaysia or even Pakistan, for example, the Sharia boards at the bank levels of the financial institutions, they create this Islamic law which is used in the industry. Now, given this, these propositions, my last part of the lecture tries to apply these principles in contemporary Islamic finance. And I basically start with try to understand the current inequalities in the economy. One perspective from an Islamic finance perspective would be that the current inequalities in the economies are due to the interest-based system. By definition, riba is exploitative, and when you have a financial system which is based on riba, it will bring in inequalities in the system. So what has Islamic finance to offer? So it should offer an alternative to an interest-based system, and that is by basically implementing the religious laws. But when we look at the practice of Islamic finance, we see that the Islamic financial sector is mimicking the conventional finance very closely, and this is done by using what, as I mentioned, the Islamic positive law, which is the interpretation of law by the Sharia scholars at the financial institution level. Now, I will skip this slide because it basically looks at the different propositions and how it links to the Islamic financial sector, but I'll go to a specific example which is in some ways reflects what is happening in terms of the religious law and positive law application in Islamic finance and its implication in terms of justice. Now, one of the products which is widely used in Islamic finance is what we call a wakala-based deposit product. Wakala is basically an agency contract where the investors, they invest money with a bank, and the bank works as an agent to manage these funds. So the bank takes a small fee. According to the Islamic, the Sharia, the basic idea is that the owners of the deposits, they should bear the risk and return of these investments. So if there's a profit, the profit should go to the investors. If there's a loss, the investor should bear the loss. So this is the basic idea from a Sharia point of view. But what has happened in the industry is they have brought in some conditions within the structure. And usually you have this product which has, in some ways, an expected return. So this is the expected return, which says 5%. And the contract says if the return is more than 5%, then it will go to the financial institution as an incentive because it has performed well. So anything excess of 5% will go to the financial institution. If the return is lower than 5% or if there's a loss, basically the investors bear the loss. Now if you look at this here, we have basically made the relationship between risk and returns asymmetric. And to the extent that this kind of structure is actually worse than an interest-based structure in terms of from an investor's perspective. In an interest-based structure, the investors, they get 5% irrespective of what happens to the bank. But in this case, if the bank does well, the client gets 5%, but if any excess is kept by the financial institution, but if the return is less than 5% or if there's a loss, the investors bear a loss. So the investors don't take the upside, but they bear the downside. And as I said, from an investor's perspective, this structure is actually worse than an interest-based contract. So this is in some ways a reflection that the practice of Islamic finance is replicating the conventional, and in the process, the weaknesses in terms of injustice and these things are actually in some ways being implemented within the Islamic financial sector. I think I'll stop there. My 20 minutes up, I think. Thank you.
You, Professor Ahmed, for you also keeping it within the time range. Now it's time for Sabri Orman to deliver his speech. He will do his speech in Turkish. Please, be sure that your headphones are working for simultaneous translation.
İsmi İBN Haldun olan bir üniversitede
Phones for here as well for our participants. headphones. Thank you.
İsmi İBN Haldun olan bir üniversitede ve onun mukaddime ismini taşıyan bir salonunda İbn Haldun konusunu konuşuyor olmak hoştur. Neden öyle aslında sanki biraz fazlaya kaçtı gibi de düşünülebilir. Bu İbn Haldun'un hikayesi hatırlandığı zaman biraz önce söylediğim manayı kazanır. Biliyorsunuz İbn Haldun asırlarca fark edilmemiş olarak kalan ilginç ve önemli bir düşünür. Dolayısıyla bu tür onu hatırlatmaya, anmaya ve çalışmaya yönelik çabalar bir bakıma bir şekilde tarihin mağduru olmuş bir alime gecikmiş bir minnet ödemesi makamındadır. Şimdi benim tebliğimin başlığı İbn Haldun'un iktisadi felsefesi. Bu tür başlıklar biraz müphem başlıklardır ve aslında bu müphemlik konuya da yansır. Onun için benim üzerinde konuşacağım konular İbn Haldun'un düşüncesinin spesifik bir konusu değildir. Diyebilirim ki ben İbn Haldun'un bazı interdisipliner, bazen multidisipliner özellik taşıyan konulardaki bazı düşünceleri üzerinde duracağım. Bu multidisipliner olduğunu veyahut interdisipliner olduğunu söylediğim noktaların bir tarafında iktisadi realiteler vardır. Diğer tarafında da bazı normatif disiplinler vardır. Normatif disiplinlerin örnekleri olarak metodolojiyi, hukuku, ahlakı ve siyaseti verebiliriz. Dolayısıyla benim bugün üzerinde duracağım konular iktisadi realitelerle bu normatif disiplinlerin kesiştiği noktalar olacaktır. Bu niyetle ne kadar tutarlı kalabilirim konuşmamın sonunda göreceğiz. Bakalım. Fakat asıl konuya geçmeden önce Türkiye'de İbn Haldun konusunda yapılan çalışmaların şöyle kısa bir hatırlatmasını yapmak istiyorum. İbn Haldun Batı'da 19. yüzyılın başlarında yeniden keşfedilmişti. Osmanlı'da daha evvel bir keşif söz konusuydu ama bu keşif bir süreklilik halini almadı. Bizde ise 1940'lardan itibaren İbn Haldun'un yeniden fark edilmeye başlandığı, önemsenmeye başlandığı görülür. Tam olarak 1940 tarihinde İlmi Ziya Ülken ile Ziyaettin Fahri Fındıkoğlu'nun 200 küsur sayfayı aşan, bir taraftan onun düşüncesini tahlil eden, diğer tarafından mukaddimeden parçalar içeren bir çalışması yayınlanmıştı. Hilmi Ziya Ülken'in 1940'lı yılların sonlarına doğru yayınlanan bir kitabında da İbn Haldun'la ilgili hayli uzun bir bölüm vardır. Fakat bence Türkiye'de İbn Haldun çalışmalarıyla ilgili en kayda değer 1951 yılında gerçekleşti. Bu da aynı zamanda benim doktora tezi danışmanım da olan Profesör Doktor Sabri Ülgener'in Darlık Buhranları kitabının yayınlanmasıydı. Darlık buhranları kendi başına önemli bir çalışmadır. Fakat onun kadar önemli bir nokta, darlık buhranları içinde İbn Haldun'un iktisadi dalgalanmalarla ilgili veyahut iktisadi dengesizliklerle ilgili düşüncelerinin de ele alınmış olmasıdır. Çok kaliteli bir çalışmadır. Fakat daha büyük bir çalışmanın çerçevesi içinde yer aldığı için pek de fark edilmemiştir. Bence İbn Haldun çalışmaları konusunda, özellikle onların iktisatla ilgili boyutu konusunda Ülgener'in çalışması bir şeydir, bir dönüm noktasıdır. Çok kişi tarafından okunmadığını tahmin edebiliriz. Fakat okunduğu kadarıyla çok önemsendiğini de aynı şekilde söyleyebiliriz. Burada şunu söyleyeyim, İbn Haldun'un iktisadi düşüncesiyle ilgili en çok referans alan kaynak, eğer yanlış hatırlamıyorsam 1964'te yayınlanan Spengler'in makalesidir. Bence kalite olarak Ülgener'in çalışması Spengler'inkinden hiç de geri kalmaz. Hatta daha spesifik bir konu olması ve onu dirayetle ele alması bakımından daha değerli olduğu dahi söylenebilir. Nihayet, burada bitirici bir liste vermeye çalışmıyorum. Sadece bazı önemli çalışmalara değinmeye çalışıyorum. 1970'li yılların ikinci yarısında Ümit Hasan'ın İbn Haldun'un siyaset teorisiyle ilgili doktora tezi yayınlandı. Önemli bir çalışmaydı ve zannediyorum hak ettiği ilgiyi de gördü yayınlandığı zaman. Fakat aynı şekilde sözünü edemeyeceğimiz bir başka çalışma 1980'li yılların başında yayınlandı. Bu da İbrahim Erol Kozak'ın İbn Haldun'un iktisadi ve sosyal düşüncesiyle ilgili çalışmasıdır. Ben bu kitabın neden hak ettiği ilgiyi görmediğini bir türlü anlayamıyorum ve hayret etmeye devam ediyorum. Hayretimin bir ifadesi de mesela bu sempozyumda İbrahim Erol Kozak niye yok? Onun ayarında İbn Haldun çalışan birisinin bence burada olması gerekirdi. Hocam diyor ki kendisi gelmedi, mesele yok. Eğer kendisi gelmemişse mesele yok. Çok güzel. Çok güzel çünkü çok kıymetli bir çalışma. Yani İbrahim Erol Kozak'ın çalışması genişliğinde İbn Haldun üzerine başka çalışma henüz yapılmadı. Şimdi benim ne kadar vaktim var Sayın? 12 dakika iyi. 12 dakikada hayli şey yapabiliriz. Şimdi mukaddimeye baktığımız zaman, mukaddime ilginç bir eser. Bir kere yeni bir ilmin tesis edilmesini, kurulması iddiasını taşır. Bu birçok bakımdan önemlidir. Yani İslam tarihinin o safhasında yeni bir ilim inşasının ortaya çıkması bir kere kendi başına değerlidir ve kayda değer. Sonrakiler bakımından da üzerinde durulmaya değer bir hadisedir. Ve sadece iddia değil, iddiasıyla tutarlı bir çabayı, bir ürünü de temsil etmesi bakımından ayrıca önemlidir. Mukaddimeye genel olarak baktığımız zaman, mukaddime ilmul umran diye veyahut medeniyet ilmi diyebileceğimiz bir ilim kurma iddiasını taşır ve bunu 6 bölüm içinde yapmaya çalışır. İlk bölüm genel olarak umran ilminin tesisi üzerinedir. Bu çok ilginç bir bölümdür. Adeta burada birçok konu, birçok alan, bugün disiplin diyebileceğimiz birçok ilmi disiplin, bu yeni ilmin tesisi konusunda seferber edilmiş gibidir. Orada sosyoloji görürsünüz, antropoloji görürsünüz, etnografya görürsünüz. Daha ilginç bir şey, iktisadi coğrafya görürsünüz. Bütün bunlar yeni kurulması istenen ilmul umranın temelini kurmak için harekete geçirilen entelektüel enstrümanlardır diyebiliriz. İkinci bölümde bu defa ilmul umranın 2 alt dalı olan bedevi umran konusu işlenir. Eğer yanılmıyorsam 4. bölümde ise Hazeri ya da yerleşik umran konusu işlenir. Böylece genel olarak umran, bedevi umran ve Hazeri umran şeyleriyle, boyutlarıyla aslında yeni bir ilmin tesisi projesi gerçekleşmiş gibidir. Diğer bölümlerde mesela 3. bölümde bu inşanın yani ilmül umranın siyasi boyutu işlenir. 5. Bölümünde ise ekonomik boyutunun tesis edilmeye çalıştığı söylenebilir. Nihayet son bölümünde yani 6. bölümdür aynı zamanda bu. Son bölümde ise ilmül umranın entelektüel tarafı, boyutu tesis edilmeye çalışılır. Çok tutarlı bir projedir, çok kompakt bir projedir ve bence başarılı bir projedir. Bu konuda hayıflanılabilecek tek şey bir devamının ondan sonra gelmemiş olmasıdır. Bu kadar başarılı bir projenin takipçilerinin olması gerekirdi. Bunun olmamış olması da çözülmeye değer, üzerinde durmaya değer bir muamma niteliğindedir. Şimdi benim tahsisi olarak üzerinde duracağım konulara gelince, İBN Haldun'un düşüncesinin iktisadi realiteleri ya da iktisadi gerçekleri bazı normlarla irtibatlandırma çabasını ben 3 noktada toparladım. Bunlardan bir tanesi İBN Haldun'un metodolojisiyle ilgilidir. Biliyorsun metodoloji de normatif bir disiplindir aslında. Ve burada aynı zamanda hukuk da devreye girer. İlginç bir şey, İBN Haldun mukaddimedeki metodolojisinin önemli bir kısmını veyahut ilmi umranı tesis çabasının önemli bir kısmını usulü fıkıhtan aldığı bazı şemalara dayandırır. Biliyorsunuz usulü fıkıhta 3 maslahat düzeyini temsil eden bir şema vardır. Zaruriyat, haciyat ve tahsiniyat. Kemaliyat diyor eğer yanılmıyorsam İBN Haldun. Böyle bir ihtiyaçlar tasnifi vardır, şeması vardır. İlginç bir şekilde İBN Haldun şeyi açıklarken, ilmül umranı tesis etmeye çalışırken bu şemanın kavramlarına referansta bulunur. Mesela bedevi umrandaki ihtiyaçlar seviyesinin zaruriyete tekabül ettiğini söyler. Yani geçimlik düzeydeki bir ekonomiye tekabül eder. Halbuki yerleşik umrandaki ekonomik seviye ise artık onun üstüne çıkmıştır ve haciyat ile tahsiniyat veyahut kemaliyat diyebileceğimiz unsurlara tekabül eder. Burada interdisipliner dediğim çabanın bir başka örneğini görüyorsunuz. Yani yeni bir ilmin tesisinde usulü fıkhın kavramları kullanılıyor. Bunu başka bir yerde de görürsünüz. Eğer zamanım yeterse değinebileceğimi umarım. Mesela adaletsizlikten bahsederken İslamiyet'in adalet konusunu vurgulaması, adaletsizliğin yol açtığı olumsuz sonuçları önlemeye yöneliktir. Onun için der ki, usulü fıkıhta usulü hamse yani 5 esas olarak bilinen 5 temel insan hakkının emniyet altına alınmasına çalıştığı görülür. Buna referansta bulunur. Bunlar biliyorsunuz hayat hakkı, dini inanış hakkı, nesil hakkı, mal edinme hakkı yani mülkiyet hakları ve nesil gibi umarım listeyi tam anlatabildim. Evet. Bu mesela bu da aynı şekilde yine usulü fıkıhtan alınmış bir şeydir, bir kavramdır. Ve İBN Haldun kendi yeni ilmini tesis ederken onu usulü fıkıhtan yararlanırken görür. Diğer bir konu İBN Haldun'un mukaddimede iktisadi realitelerden bahsederken ahlakı da devreye sokmasıdır. Ahlakın normatif bir disiplin olduğunu söylemeye gerek yok. Burada sadece 3 noktaya değineceğim. Bunlardan bir tanesi lüksün zararıdır veyahut buna aslında lüks demek yeterli gelmiyor gibi. Nasıl diyelim? Aylak ve tüketimi zirvede bir tabakanın ortaya çıkması. Bir taraftan üretmemekte, diğer taraftan aşırı tüketmekte olan bir şeyin ortaya çıkması. İbn Haldun bunu eleştiriyor. Ve ona göre eğer üretmiyorsanız sizin yemeye de hakkınız yoktur. Halbuki burada üretmeyen ama ölçüsüz bir şekilde, orantısız bir şekilde tüketen bir tabakadan söz edilmektedir. İbn Haldun bu konu üzerinde çok durur. Ben sadece 2 yönüne işaret edeceğim. Bir taraftan bu durumun finansmanı üzerinde durur. Bunun finansmanının çok büyük bir problem olduğundan bahseder ve bunun sonunda medeniyetin ya da umranın zevalı ile sonuçlanacağını söyler. Diğer taraftan da bu durum aynı şekilde ahlaki bir yozlaşmaya yol açar. Bu da diğer yönden yine umranın çöküşüne götüren bir faktör halini alır. Der ki burada önemli bir şey olarak şunu söyleyeyim, muruetin kaybedilmesinden söz eder. Yani bu şekildeki insanlar artık yiğitliklerini, mertliklerini, adamlıklarını kaybetmişlerdir. Ve kendilerini savunabilecek durumda değillerdir. Üretme kapasiteleri yoktur. Bunlar dolayısıyla bir avcının gelip kendilerini avlamasını bekleyen av durumundadırlar. Ve o da çok geçmeden zuhur eder, gelir. Diğer bir konu, daha önceki konuşmalarda da üzerinde haylice durulduğu için ben sadece işaret edeceğim, adaletsizlik meselesidir. İbn Haldun adaletsizlik meselesini sadece bir ahlaki konu olarak da almaz, bir hayat memat meselesi olarak alır. Ona göre adaletsizliğin olduğu bir yerde devletin, toplumun devam edebilmesi mümkün değildir. Benden önceki konuşmada zaten bu konu üzerinde duruldu. Diğeri, bugün zannediyorum herkesin çok aşina olduğu bir şey, diyor ki boyun eğme ve uysallıkla gelir elde etme, zenginlik elde etme arasında olumlu bir ilişki vardır. Yani eğer zenginleşmek istiyorsanız, para kazanmak istiyorsanız biraz uysal olacaksınız, sempatik olacaksınız, boyun eğeceksiniz. Aksi halde sizin normal kaderiniz biraz sıkıntılı bir hayat yaşamak olur der. Son nokta onun iktisadi politika ile ilgili görüşleridir. İktisadi politikada biliyorsunuz normatif bir yönüyle, bütün yönüyle değil, bir yönüyle normatif bir disiplindir. Orada da İBN Haldun'un üzerinde durduğu 3 noktaya sadece temas edeceğim. Bunlardan bir tanesi ünlü vergi meselesidir. Biliyorsunuz ona göre der ki medeniyetin ilk safhasında veyahut bir devletin kurulduğu ilk safhada daha düşük ve daha az sayıda vergi vardır. Buna rağmen daha büyük bir vergi geliri vardır. Halbuki zamanla biraz önce söylediğimiz şeylerin, lüksün, zulümlerin vesaire devreye girmesinden sonra vergilerin sayısı da artar, vergilerin oranları da artar. Buna rağmen vergi gelirleri azalır. Bu önemli bir noktadır ve bazen Laffer eğrisi diye ifade edilir. Bazen denir ki işte İbn Haldun'da Laffer eğrisi yok. Yok var fakat İbn Haldun'un bu konu üzerinde durduğu çok açıktır. Yalnız şunu söyleyeyim, bu vergiyle ilgili olarak kısaca ifade ettiğim konu İbn Haldun'dan önce de İslam düşünceleri, alimleri arasında bilinen ve üzerinde durulan bir konuydu. İbn Haldun onu tekrar vurgulu bir şekilde ele almış olmaktadır diyebiliriz. Çok heyecanlandırmalı başkanımızı. Diğer konu devletin ekonomik hayata, özellikle ticarete girmesidir. Bunun üzerinde de duruldu. Devletin iktisadi hayata girmesinin, hele malik olarak girmesinin çok zararlı olduğu kanaatindedir. Bu diyor, kısaca ifade edersek hem halka zarar verir, ekonomik hayata zarar verir, hem de zaten vergi gelirlerinin de kaybına yol açar. Çünkü devlet malik olarak ekonomik hayata girdiği zaman kendisini vergileyecek değildir ya. Nihayet son son noktaya geliyorum. Bu da bizim bugün siyasi rant veya siyaset yoluyla rant elde etme dediğimiz, rant peşinde koşma dediğimiz şeydir. İbn Haldun bu konuda son derece sarihtir daha doğrusu. Diyor ki, iyi zengin olmak için makam mevki sahibi olmaya da icap eder. Buna cah der. Bu da aslında diğer İslam alimlerinin çok aşinası oldukları bir konudur. Okuyun mesela İslam ahlak literatürünü. Maal ve cah en çok üzerinde durulan iki konudur. İbn Haldun da bu konu üzerinde durur fakat çok daha ayrıntılı durur ve vurgulu durur. Der ki eğer haddinden fazla zenginlik ancak makam mevkiyle yani cahla beraber olduğu zaman mümkündür. Aksi halde normal tüccar, normal sanatkar, normal tarımla uğraşan insan para kazanır fakat çok da fazla bir para olmaz bu. Ben durumu zorlandığım için özür diliyorum ve dinlediğiniz için de herkese çok teşekkür ediyorum.
Estağfurullah hocam, çok teşekkürler. Son olarak Malezya'dan, yani dünyanın diğer tarafından Darım'dan sonra İngiltere, sonra Türkiye Daha sonra doğuya gidiyoruz ve Malezya'dan bir arkadaşımız var, Mohammad ziyaretçi. Kendisi sunumunu gerçekleştirecek. Thank you. Please.
السلام الله عليكم. الحمد لله الذي هدانا لهذا وما كنا لنهتدي لولا أن هدانا الله. وصدق الله العظيم. First and foremost, based on the hadith, "Man lam yashkurin nas lam yashkurillah." So we are indeed grateful to the İBN HALDUN family, and I should mention, for the first time, I could have opportunity to attend international conference in 2017 possibly, but I couldn't get the opportunity to present because of my exam back in Malaysia. So alhamdulillah, once again we have the opportunity to have to being in such a elegant scholarly banquet, alhamdulillah, since the yesterday. And we should say the moment we entered Turkey, we are constantly, alhamdulillah, learning from this scholarly square, alhamdulillah. So we are really grateful. And actually, the time is very limited, so it's quite impossible, especially for me, like a very apprentice student, and all those towering figure sitting in front of me. It's quite challenging for me to articulate all the ideas. But I'll try, inshallah, my best to give at least some brief reflections that will lead to understand what we are going to explore based on the Khaldunian understanding as he has articulated in his Muqaddimah, inshallah. And I would like to begin by saying that in order for us to read any text, not only medieval, any text, we think we should keep in mind 4 things. Number 1, the language we're trying to read. Number 2, the impulse of the author who is writing the text. And number 3, the language we are going to translate into. And number 4, the audience we are going to address. So with that, if we assess or we try to locate the writings of İBN HALDUN, rahimahullah, then we should say there are complex tapestries in the Islamic intellectual heritage. And in terms of law, philosophy, legal principles, we may say we have 2 trends. Number 1 is السياسة الشرعية, and number 2, al-maqasid al-shar'iyya. Though in the present time, we got to know al-maqasid al-shar'iyya is a very nascent discipline, and we should be humble to mention that it is not, actually. It was there in the very beginning of the emergence of legal principles from the very first century, Islamic century, Hijri century. Allahu a'lam bis-sawab. So, if we look at the contents, and at the muqaddimah of muqaddimah, so we would say it is a kind of a siyasa shar'iyya account put forward by İBN HALDUN rahimahullah in his muqaddimah. And just to give a brief account of a siyasa shar'iyya, we would say actually the understanding or articulation of a siyasa shar'iyya, it had began just in the 2nd Hijri century. So we may look into Kalila Dimna, articulated by Ibn al-Muqaffa in the court of Abbasid dynasty. And then we may see Mahasin al-Sharia by Abu Bakr al-Qaffal. And also we see in the Murabit court, Abu Bakr al-Turtushi, who is the professor and ustaz of Abu Bakr ibn al-Arabi rahimahullah. And then also we see Al-Fahri, Al-Amri, Al-Hadrami, who is writing Al-Ishara في تدبير الإمارة. And also we see Ibn Rudwan is another Murabit political philosopher and jurist who is advising Abu Salim al-Murabit. And then also we see Mir'atu Zaman, written and structured by Sibtu ibn al-Jawzi, Abdul Rahman ibn al-Jawzi. He's the 6th century scholar. He was writing Mir'atu Zaman. And then also we have so many other Siyasa Shar'iyya book. As we know, prominent or very familiar ones is Al-Ahkam al-Sultaniyya by Mawardi, Al-Ahkam al-Sultaniyya, Abu Ya'la al-Farra, also Al-Hisba, and Siyasa Shar'iyya written by Ibn Taymiyyah, rahimahumullah, Jami'a. So, and Ibn Khaldun, rahimahullah, actually somehow influenced by all those earlier scholars when he is writing this important issue. So I would like to locate Muqaddimah of Ibn Khaldun rahimahullah ta'ala in the category of a Siyasa al-Shar'iyya book, and hence by definition he is constantly trying to advise not the rulers themselves in his own time, we should say rather the rulers in time to come. Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Ya ayyuha alladhina amanu attaqullah wal tanzur nafsum ma qaddamat lighat wattaqullah inna allaha khabirun bima ta'malun. So, O you who believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, wal tanzur nafsum ma qaddamat lighat. Yani, you should have nazar in the things you are going to deposit for the day, for the tomorrow. And I would like to translate tomorrow in this way, and also today. Actually, what we are undergoing or what we are enjoying, it is the production of yesterday. I mean, our forefathers. And so is the case, what we are doing today, and it will contribute to the formulation of the tomorrow that will affect our next generations or the generations to come in the future. So Ibn Khaldun rahimahullah ta'ala, inspired by that understanding of collectivity beyond space and time, actually he was trying to address all those issues from a very collective, holistic, philosophical basis that will cover not only his own time, rather the times come in the millennia. And why I'm saying so? Because his understanding is influenced by Imam Ghazali alayhi rahmah, Ibn al-Arabi rahimahullah, Abu Bakr al-Tartushi, all those earlier professors and ulama. So let me allow to mention on a striking comment put forward by Imam Ghazali rahimahullah in his Al-Mustasfa. He says, "Man lam yatamantaq fala thiqata bi'ilmihi." He who doesn't master the science of philosophy, his knowledge should not be trusted on. And with that understanding, we do say Ibn Khaldun rahimahullah ta'ala, actually he was trying to philosophize his experiences that will help the rulers in his own time, also the rulers in the time to come. And I would substantiate my claim like this. He's mentioning in his Muqaddimah, وَلَمْ يُلَاحِظُوا أَسْبَابَ الْوَقَايَا وَالْأَحْوَالِ وَلَمْ يُرَاعُوهَا. And he's trying to say we have so many historians who are just narrating and collecting informations, and they are not trying to assess the behind reasons, what are the stimuli that contributed to the happenings, all those histories, either positive or negative. And by saying so, impliedly he's claiming that my account of collecting history is not only for telling a story and events to the audience, rather it is a kind of assessment and examination why so happens in history, so that the generations to come in the future will have the lessons to formulate to govern themselves successfully. So with this, I will try to have some 3 propositions actually. Number one, I will be trying to focus on jibaya, taxation policy, along with its nexus to the production industry in a domestic level. And also I'll try to relevantize this idea, Khaldunian economic understanding, or we can say Khaldunian intertwining living thread of philosophy, Iqtisad and jurisprudence to MDGs, Millennium Development Goals. And I'll also try what is the behind causes for the economic chaotic outcomes and consequences that we are undergoing across the green planet. And I think it is no more that green, that actually we need to survive and live a good life. So we are trying to read his chapter 1, Kas, Ma'ash, and Jibaya. Jibaya also, obviously, he put forward in different chapter. So as there is a nexus between these two, so we're trying to establish a kind of nexus between Jibaya, taxation policy, and Kas, Ma'ash, livelihood and earning sources. So he's trying to say Ma'ash is derived from Aish. Aish meaning to live life through the means, livelihood. So he's saying Ma'ash derived from Aish, and Ma'ash is a kind of, if you allow me to say, is ismul zarf, and zarf is based on a space and time. So he's saying based in line with the demand of time and space, you have to adapt, you have to formulate mechanisms that would allow you to survive the challenges through making good livelihood. So my understanding was, if so is the Ma'ash, then based on the understanding of Ma'ash, semantically speaking, our job is to adopt a policy nationally and internationally that will help us to make livelihood and ultimately lead us to the flourishment that we need. And when he is advising, as in the very beginning I mentioned, it's Siyasa Shar'iyya account of Ibn Haldun rahimahullah. So he is advising the rulers, for you to survive from ruling point of view, you need to adopt industry-friendly taxation policy that will allow to collect more custom duties, more monies, and you should also restore and you should also refund all those custom duties and monies in a very organized and motivating way that will allow the industry, production industry, embolden their production capacity. And the vice versa, if any rulers that overtax the citizenry, actually it is a zulm, and here is striking an historical comment, وَالظُّلْمُ مُؤَذِّنٌ بِخَرَابِ الْعُمْرَانِ. Injustice is the declarer, and in our sense, mu'adhin, 5 times a day we have mu'adhin, the call to prayer. So when there is injustice, it means that someone is declaring, oh, there is destruction on the verge of our shoulder, anytime we may go to dissolution. So he's trying to say, any ruler, if in his engagement with public affairs, do injustice, then it is none but he is destroying himself, including the state collectively. So he's saying, actually, this is a fundamental essence of Sharia to protect not only ruler, but also every single human being on earth. And in that case, he's citing from Ghazali possibly, he's saying, المقاصد الشرعية الضرورة الخمسة من حفظ الدين والنفس والعقل والنسل والمال. So by doing injustice, إن الظلم, by doing injustice actually انقطاع النوع البشري. First he's saying Umran. In our present day context, we may translate it to be civilization. And then he is trying to concise it more. And he says, انقطاع النوع البشري. Arthat zulm, every single human species will be susceptible to destruction if zulm is there. So according to Ibn Khaldun's Zulm epistome, actually in a very domestic level, almost all the countries are undergoing this Zulum phobia or Zulum reality, actually injustice reality, through which any given country is seriously hindering themselves from flourishing. And I was talking about taxation policy. I would give an example from my own locality, British Bengal. So Robert Travers, Bradley Bird, and Sinha, Professor Omar, these are some very prominent authorities on the British Bengals, and they are rightly put forward that once this part of the globe was more flourishing, thriving, and maybe this part also contributed to clothing the world and to economizing the world, but due to heavy taxation imposed by British companies, this part turned to be the very poorest part of the world. So in domestic level, production industry will flourish if these Zulm rulers, or in our present day context, if the parliaments or the law-making authorities, they keep in their mind we shouldn't make any policy that ultimately do injustice, and who is Ibn Khaldun says, Al-udwan ala nas fi amwalihim dhahibun bi amalihim fi tahsiliha wa iktisabiha. Meaning to say, injustice actually when imposed, when suffered, when undergone by any human being or at large the public, then their hope and aspiration to produce wealth, property, it also follows by that loss of aspiration. And ultimately, they just totally get stagnant, and which finally may lead to the dissolution of a given nation where the people are undergoing this injustice. So actually, I will try to expand this Zulm, how it is contributing today to the ultimate destruction of the planet. If you allow me to mention, the green planet now is quite pale planet. And in this case, I'll mention one verse and cite one verse. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. من عمل صالحا فلنفسه ومن أساء فعليها. He who does good deed, it benefits him, and he who does reverse, the detriment and harm affect him. So with the language of Naqib al-Attas, he says actually zulum or justice or injustice begin with the self and also ends with the self. And in that case, I'll mention Abu Bakr al-Turtushi, who is mentioning in his book Sirajul Muluk. Actually, the rulers, as-sultanu qalbun kama anna fil jasad qalb. Yani, the ruler or the executive or the governance system is a kind of heart. And once heart gets healed, the entire body, the ra'aya, the collective citizens will be healed and they will act accordingly. And if the rulers, and in Abu Bakr Turtushir context, if the rulers fail to release himself from the shackle of desires, luxuriosity, and overconsumption of wealth and property, then actually it will inflict the whole public at large. And ultimately the entire nation will go in despair and dissolution. And in one hadith, Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam says, "Sinfani min ummati, idha saluha nas, al-umara wal-ulama." So as my time is finishing, so I would conclude this way. Actually, for the last 20, 30 years, one of the key discipline appearing in the academia is moral economy, and it was before maybe when in 3rd century scholastic, European scholastic, they rediscovered the Aristotelian ethics. It was there, but over the time, due to secularization or due to technicalization of economics and some hard sciences, now the moral concern is totally diverse from the economic engagement. So there is the issue of zulm, injustice, which is ruling over almost every one of us. And whereas, coming back to the Islamic tradition, due to irreconcilable sense of responsibility towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in the Islamic tradition, there is a very strict, and we should say irreconcilable nexus between morality, ethics, and daily engagement, nationally, globally. So, if really we want to restore the greenery image on the planet, we need to restore the concept of self-reflection, ultimate responsibility, first and foremost to myself, that ultimately goes to God, Creator, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and actually only then we may have the chance to survive the challenges in the time to come. وَمَا تَوْفِيقِ إِلَّا بِاللَّهِ وَالسَّلَامُ عَلَيْكُمْ وَرَحْمَةُ اللَّهِ.
Many thanks for keeping the presentation in the time limits. Any questions to our speakers will be welcome, but we are really getting out of time. But we have, I think, some 10 minutes for questions. We can take yours. Please, can you?
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. My name is Lisa from Indonesia. So first of all, thank you for all the distinguished speakers for the fruitful presentation. So I have some questions. Maybe the first question goes to Prof. Rodney. As also you acknowledge in your abstract that there is an issue on the credit scoring that is used by, as acknowledged as the popular methodology to assess the risk management. So do you have any a proposal which one of the methodology that may be more fit with the Sharia perspective so that it will not result with the same issue with what the conventional way to assessing the risk? And the second question goes to Prof. Habib. Prof. Habib here proposing that there is a requirement to establish separate independent institution to interpret the religious law. So do you think that this can work in the current system when there are in some countries, including in my country, Indonesia, there is a dual banking system. So actually even there is a independent Sharia council in the country, there are still and I'm not sure, maybe you can elaborate how can, in practical ways, this can to be implemented. And maybe the third question goes to Mr. Sabri. From the regulator perspective, actually, how is actually if we found interesting or insightful policy that maybe can be implemented to the state or from the regulatory perspective, what is the enabling environment or requirement to really implement it? Is it really the only requirement is the political will of the authority, or is there any other requirement to implement any, for example, any insight from the IBN HALDUN to be implemented in the policy? Thank you.
Thank you. We are finished with time, so that we have just 2 minutes for each question.
I will be having 2 questions. My first question goes to Professor Wilson.
Please, one question.
Okay.
And because there is another question there, I want to be just.
Okay, so actually my question is that what is the value, or actually do Islamic banking conventional banks add values to each other, or should I just conceive them as two different systems that do not intersect? And in terms of risk management, I couldn't see much difference between the conventional bank in terms of sharing and transferring risks and actually the Islamic bank. So, and how can we relate that to the İBN Haldun'un philosophy? Thank you.
Yes.
My question to Professor Wilson, given the paradox that we have a central bank with some commercial banks that seeks to maximize their profits, and on the other hand, we have people that are not morally behaved. So given this paradox of immorality and profit maximizing roots, is it really possible to establish a profit-sharing Islamic bank? Or are we just simply mimicking the commercial and the other commercial banks, just simply maximizing their profits? Thank you.
Yes, I'll answer the questions, perhaps in reverse order, actually, if you don't mind. The issue about basically Islamic banks essentially being, as I indicated, they're doing the same kind of, financing the same kind of activity as conventional banks, but they're doing it in a Sharia-compliant way, so it's more the means rather than the ends, basically, in terms of what they're concerned with. I think that's largely arisen because of the history, the recent history over the last 40 years or so of Islamic banking. Dubai Islamic Bank became the kind of model. It was founded back in 1975, a long time ago, and it essentially was functioning as a bank for trade financing, and the trade financing that it was doing was Sharia compliant, but it was similar to the trade financing done by conventional banks. The difference being that it was basically using largely murabaha for the financing, whereas conventional banks weren't using that. So it was, but that doesn't preclude the operation of different types of banks. For example, you can have Islamic microfinancing institutions. You can have Islamic banks that are cooperatives that cater for poorer people, and there's less financial exclusion. But the model which has become the predominant model is based on banks, Islamic banks, which are listed companies. They're producing dividends for their shareholders. They're aiming to have reasonable profits, and also aiming at capital gains for their shareholders. So their objectives are not so different to conventional banks for most Islamic banks, but essentially how they achieve those objectives is different. So that's hopefully answers your question. I can elaborate a bit more in informal discussion. There was a question about credit scoring. I'll maybe go to that next. Again, the credit scoring in Islamic banks is not a standardized method of credit scoring. What we can basically say is that they allow for the fact that clients can get into difficulties. They're more lenient, potentially, than conventional banks. However, there are moral hazard problems, as I pointed out in the slide. People can abuse that, and unfortunately do, but it's not very common. But it does happen, basically. There have been various cases, I won't mention cases by name, but there have been various cases where there have been problems, basically. So it's not so different. And of course, you can't really say you can have, each bank decides its own credit scoring. It's up to the bank, basically. And obviously, some banks which are basically more established probably have a potentially superior customer base. Those that are more recently established are quite often fishing around for new customers, and they're perhaps potentially looking for higher returns, actually, on their financing, reflecting the fact that these new customers may be basically more risky. So there are sort of issues in terms of that. Then we had the question in terms of different types of risk management and risk by Islamic banks. What tends to be most different? I mean, the liquidity risk is the same. Yeah, they're holding with operational risk, it's the same. Islamic banks, because of their particular characteristics, maybe there's some differences, but that reflects size and so on, rather than the Islamic nature of the institution. Where the difference occurs is specifically with credit risk. Because again, coming back to the point that with credit risk, there's clear surah in the Quran. The banks have to follow, obviously, what Islamic teaching. So there would be more, and there is more, leniency potentially with credit risk than there would be for a conventional bank. But the other types of risk, it's not so different, it's the same. And obviously they all suffer the same foreign exchange risk, for example, risks of macroeconomic risk and so on. All of that doesn't differ. And there's no reason why it should. But for credit risk, yes, it does differ. And there's a good reason why it should differ. So I think that's the answer. I'm happy to elaborate more on that. Thank you.
I think my question, the question to me was on the national level Sharia board. The key issue is that when you have Sharia boards at the banks making decisions, the issue is whether these decisions are, from a Ibn Khaldunian perspective, just to both parties or not. Now, because the Sharia board members are paid by the bank and the kind of products we see that in some ways the products which come out in the market serve more the interest of the banks rather than the balance between the bank and the customers. And that's why I think we need an independent Sharia board. And as you mentioned, in Indonesia, the Sharia board is independent. And I personally know of a case where some banks tried to introduce a controversial product, Tawarruk, and the Central Sharia Board basically did not allow it, even though the bank-level Sharia boards allowed it. So I think, of course, there can be other discussions in terms of how they can operate, and it can operate in different forms. Like in Malaysia, there's a law which gives the National Sharia Board the power to decide on Sharia issues. So there has to be a legal framework under which these national Sharia boards have to operate. Thank you.
I think it will be fairer to respond to your question privately after the session. Okay? Thank you.
Thank you. Great, gratitude from you. It was a great, thank you very much. We are really getting out of time, but for this session we are okay. I think we kept within the time. Actually, we saved 2 minutes according to my calculations, which is good. Thank you very much for your attendance, and I would like to invite you to applaud the participants for their, speeches. Thank you very much to all of them. Now enjoy the lunch.